Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. And here's Elizabeth Johnson with the Peaceful Presence Project.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to share my slides here. Is that an okay visual? Okay, wonderful.
Yep, perfect.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Really grateful to be able to join you for this evening's presentation, and I hope a space where we can have some follow-up conversation, reflection, Q&A, etc. So the focus of this evening's offering is grief literacy for the cancer journey, and what it looks like to really support ourselves and one another during this experience. And before I begin, I just want to take a moment to really acknowledge you all in this space, whether you are navigating a diagnosis yourself, whether you are sitting beside someone you love through treatment or somewhere in the long terrain of survivorship. Just want to really acknowledge that you are carrying something real. Today, we're going to talk about grief, and not because we or I want to make things heavier, but because naming what we are carrying is often the first step toward really being able to share the weight of it. And to really just start off by saying grief does not mean that you have given up hope. Grief does not mean that you are not strong. Grief really means that you love something, whether it's your body, your future, your sense of certainty, your life as you knew it, and something has changed. So the goal today is to not make everyone a grief expert, but rather just to open up a space for exploration around how we all might give and extend a different quality of support around the grief experience. And so just to really say, I'm grateful to have you in this shared space today. And just to give you a little bit of kind of background about myself. So I work as the executive director, and I am the co-founder of a nonprofit called the Peaceful Presence Project. We do a variety of different things. We train individuals at the community level to the what's oftentimes referred to as the end-of-life doula skill set. So really seeking to build up capacity at the community level so that people are have a different literacy around the grief and the serious illness and the death and dying experience. We will all arrive there at some point. So really encouraging people to develop a different capacity to be with one another in these experiences. So that's professionally what I do on the day to day. I also just want to name that when I was 15, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that experience was really, really fundamental and transformative in my own life. I was the oldest of four children, and I quickly stepped from, a 15-year-old into an individual that was really asked to hold a lot, to navigate a lot, and went through my own deep grief experiences around that, around, breast cancer coming into the center of my family. And so there's a lot about that lived experience that also kind of activated for me this question of how do we do this differently for ourselves and one another when it comes to really being, kind of willing to turn our gaze towards the grief experience. I also had a full-term pregnancy, and shortly after giving birth to my son, the day after, there was complications to his birth, and he was taken off of life support and died in my arms. And so that also was a personal experience that really opened up my eyes to, again, this question of what does it take to really advocate for ourselves, to self-educate within ourselves and our own kind of circles of support, to develop a different capacity to get our needs met, right, when it comes to navigating these really challenging experiences. So all of that, I highlight all that just to say, I as well come to you all as a human who has been profoundly impacted by the grief experience, by serious illness. And so a lot of what I share today is also informed by those personal experiences. So I just want to speak briefly, kind of about how culture and social norms really shape our ability or our inability to really skillfully support one another through grief. And some of the things that I notice regularly, both personally and professionally, right? That one, our culture really tends to see grief as something that's very messy and then oftentimes needs to be cleaned up or fixed, right? We live in this deeply, what's kind of referred to this mastery oriented world where most problems that we face have solutions if we're smart enough to find them, and grief often gets pulled into that framework and is treated as a problem to be solved rather than this experience to be with, to integrate, and to move through. And Russ Momenicum is a trauma specialist, and he names this as premature consolation, which is this tendency to rush toward, I'm fine, I've got it, before we've actually really allowed ourselves to sit with that which is hard. We want resolution before we've done the work of really being present to the difficulty. Another layer comes in from Francis Weller, who is a psychotherapist, and he talks about how we are very culturally afraid or kind of retract from this downward movement. And as a culture, we really value this kind of posture of ascendance, of lightness, of productivity, of getting back on your feet. And people who are often grieving find themselves met with this impatience because our suffering does not mirror this cultural story that says, well, we value you when you overcome. We value you when you can demonstrate you're productive. With cancer, I think this pressure intensifies when sometimes this battle or warrior kind of language of cancer emerges, right? However well-intentioned, right? This idea of we can fight, but oftentimes inadvertently, it kind of can bring up this feeling of shame for those who feel grief or fear or exhaustion. And so the result of all of this is grief really can become very privatized and something, it's something that people are asked to carry alone, to carry in silence. The irony of it is grief and suffering are really meant to be shared and to be witnessed and to be held, right? At the core, we are very social beings who need one another. And so the more that we really bypass our own grief, I think the more it shows up kind of in these sideways, it emerges in these sideways ways. And so I think what happens is that, when we live in a culture that hasn't given us the tools to be with grief, right? When discomfort arises, whether it's in ourselves or in someone we love, we tend to respond in some predictable ways, not out of cruelty, but out of this genuine lack of practice. And so, some of the things I have here on the screen, we make people be in their pain alone. And in the cancer experience, this can look like friends who disappear after diagnosis, not because they don't care, but because they don't know what to say. And in this weird way, silence feels safer than, kind of the wrong words. We dismiss or undermine others' experiences, oftentimes because their pain is activating our own, right? And this kind of feeling of, oh, at least I caught it early. You're so strong. You've got this, right? And these are phrases that are offered with love, but they can really have the effect of kind of closing the door on what the person desperately needs to leave open, right? The space of expression of what's really happening for them. We can bypass our own suffering. And I think caregivers do this constantly, really focusing entirely on the person with cancer, telling ourselves, our own grief doesn't count or isn't appropriate right now. And I think we put enormous pressure on ourselves to say the right thing, to find the magic word, to make it better. And when we can't, we kind of retreat. We pull back precisely when the presence is needed the most. And I think we stop listening because we can become so focused on moving towards, kind of the better, right? Wanting somebody to get better, that we stop hearing where they actually are. And so there's this hyper focus on the destination versus kind of missing what is happening for the person before this. And so I think what this reveals is that people have this experience of not being presenced. We live in this very grief illiterate, pain avoidant world, and the cost of this can be profound isolation. And so, as we all know, right, for the navigation of the cancer experience, this isolation can also feel just as painful as the illness itself. And so the good news, kind of the focus of today is integrating this kind of framework of grief literacy, recognizing that there is this practice that's available to us to kind of think about some of these experiences differently. I don't want to get into all the words here on this screen, but really grief literacy itself refers to the knowledge and the skills and awareness really required to understand and support and navigate grief, both personally and then sort of at the community level. Some of the key attributes of a kind of grief literate community include this recognition that really grief is a universal experience. It's not something that happens to some of us and not all of us, right? At some point, we will all navigate grief. So grief literate community understands that grief is this natural and varied and ongoing process rather than, as I said earlier, this like problem to be fixed. A grief literate community also recognizes and acknowledges grief from non-death losses, and I'll talk more about that on a future slide. A grief literate community, people are comfortable talking about and asking about loss, asking about illness. These are experiences and emotions that really can be talked about out in the open. And then there's this ability to really understand and accept differences in grieving styles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But right, it's recognizing that grief is this really personal and complex experience, and there really is no right way to grieve. So bottom line is that when we become more grief literate, both for ourselves and by extension, for others, we become better companions for one another through illness, through the cancer experience. Again, whether it's for ourselves or for somebody that we're companioning. And we reduce, I think, the isolation that oftentimes accompanies diagnosis, treatment, survivorship. And we hopefully are creating space for this full range of what someone is feeling. We stop kind of in that pause or that retraction of waiting for the right words and just start trusting, at the end of the day, the power really comes from our presence, of our willingness to step into these spaces and to learn to ask for what we need. And I think from my own personal experiences, at the end of the day, that really is the world or the community that I really want to live in. And so that's where a lot of this work is really fueled. So again, grief literacy is really defined as the skills, the knowledge that enable very kind of thoughtful action and compassionate care for those who are in need. As I have here on the slide, not everyone has to be a grief specialist, but ideally everyone at some level is grief informed. It only benefits all of us, right? Not just those of us who are navigating illness or a loss, but kind of all of the wider circles around us, those who are suffering, those who are in the supporter role. So just to kind of explore some of the foundational concepts of grief literacy that I think in a really great way actually challenge and liberate us from these outdated beliefs and misconceptions about grief. First thing to note and to be able to share with, hopefully to remind ourselves and to share with others, is that there's really no set stages to the grief experience. And I love this visual here because I think, the early grief theories, including for those who know the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was really looking at the dying experience for people, right? From that, there was this desire to make us believe that there's these kind of 5 neat linear stages that we go through, right? Around grief. This denial into anger, bargaining, depression, and then we kind of land in this happy place of acceptance. The reality is that grief really looks and feels like the image on the right. And I think I'm hoping that all of you on this call this evening really kind of can understand the reality of this, the image on the right. It goes from this place of shock into stress, into confusion, into acceptance, back down into helplessness. And I think this is really important just to reiterate, right? That, we all think that we're doing it wrong or that we're going crazy if for some reason we don't have this very perfect, neat you. The reality is, right, that grief feels much more like the image on the right-hand side. And I think that just normalizes for all of us, right, that this is actually how grief works. Another point, right, that there's no right way to grieve. And, after my son's death, I found that I was grieving in one way. My partner was grieving in a very different way. I thought that I was right. He thought that he was right. And, just two examples of this. Kenneth Doka and Terry Martin are grief researchers and psychiatrists. And through their work of kind of observing and working with thousands of people, they found that there's actually these kind of different distinct grief responses that come up for people. And there's just two listed here on the screen, but one, intuitive grief, right? This is understood to be more of kind of the stereotypical feminine way of grieving. An intuitive griever will oftentimes kind of feel more than think about their experience. The grief expression oftentimes mirrors more inner feelings and emotions. We can kind of talk about the grief experience as kind of these waves of emotions. And this type kind of focuses on exploring and expressing feelings, processing emotions. An intuitive type will oftentimes more likely seek support from others, right? We want to express, we want to talk about it. In my experience of death with my son, I found myself much more in this intuitive response. On the other hand, the instrumental, this is kind of more the stereotypical masculine way of grieving. It can be more about thinking than feeling the experience. Grief can be expressed in more physical or cognitive or behavioral ways. For my partner, it was getting on his bike and riding 15 miles and kind of working the grief out through his body. This type is oftentimes less likely to share experiences or feelings with others. It's more of this internal kind of processing. So just an example that, we oftentimes have this innate or learned response to grief that is appropriate to us, and to remember that one response is not better than another. There's no right way. And kind of building up this kind of recognition or sensitivity to be able to kind of identify, oh, this is how this person is grieving, right? And from that, whether it's ourselves or another, to say, and what might be most helpful here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Just some other, kind of points here, that grief can feel so unpredictable. And I think the previous two slides kind of highlighted that, right? That it's this feeling of, I'm doing well today. I got out of bed. I got the kids off to school. I've been feeling great for the last 2 days. And then I kind of get hit by that wave that just makes it really difficult to do anything. There's work from a woman who wrote the book, The Grieving Brain and the Grieving Body, kind of from like a neuroscience perspective, that talks about the fact that, grief actually is, the mind works to kind of serve as this predictive tool to create this mental map of making sense of life. When the diagnosis comes, when the things shift, right, when that experience that kind of catches off guard, descends on our life, the map that we once had available to us is no longer there. And so, so much of our system is working to develop a new kind of mental life map. And so, this unpredictability, the feeling of grief as being all consuming, there's so much of our system that's actually working to reorient and reestablish a map that makes sense. That's the way that, that's a reason that it can just feel so disorienting and so consuming. Grief can involve secondary losses, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. And then, this emergence of this wave of existential questions that oftentimes could take a lot of energy as well. Dr. Alan Wolfelt is a grief counselor and the director of the Center for Loss and Life Transition. And I just, I want to highlight here on the screen that he talks about grief as, kind of this intrinsic response to loss or an experience, right? It's natural, it's necessary, it's active. It's this thing that we learn to live with and integrate. It is not an illness or a mental health issue, right? Mourning is this outward expression of grief. It's this, can be manifested in a lot of different ways. Crying, sharing memories, writing about the loss, praying, coming together in community and kind of, whatever that process looks like. I think as all of us know, like as a culture, we're sort of okay sometimes with the grief. We oftentimes don't know what to do with the mourning experience, right? We don't create spaces where people are actually able to express what is going on for them. And the damage of that, right, is that mourning is really this essential way where people begin to reconstruct their lives, right? We move it through our systems. We invite others into our experience. And so, just to think about that, what are ways in which we are letting others into, kind of whatever level of mourning is happening. It couldn't be, it may not be the fundamental, kind of experience of a death that has occurred, but I am mourning the fact that my hair is no longer, the way that it used to be, that these shifts are happening. And how do we really, kind of create a kind of an expression or a proactiveness around that to really have this experience of integration? So I just want to talk about some of the types of grief, and I'm sure that all of you on the call have, personal experience with this. I think this is just important to, kind of illuminate so that as we're going through our various human experiences, whether that's illness, whether it's accompanying or caregiving somebody in an illness experience, just kind of helps us to have a different vantage point to understand these different experiences of grief. So preparatory grief encompasses this cognitive, emotional, and spiritual response to the recognition of our own mortality and impending loss, whatever that looks like. So in the breast cancer context, this could look like mourning the body before surgery, right? Grieving a breast or one's hair, a sense of this physical wholeness before it changes. It could be the quiet mourning of, a future that really now feels very uncertain. It can also involve grieving what cancer has already made impossible, kind of what has been lost around this experience unto itself. So this is the grief of the person living with the diagnosis, right? Grieving these losses in real time and often before others around you recognize that this grief is even happening. Anticipatory grief is while preparatory grief is oftentimes felt by the person facing, our own loss, anticipatory grief can be experienced by those who love them, as well as the person navigating cancers, right? Grieving in advance the changes yet to come. And I'll talk about this more in a future slide. Complicated grief is this prolonged, intense form of grief that can persist beyond what might be expected, right? Really kind of this experience of it's difficult to move forward or find moments of peace. For most people, grief, kind of ebbs and flows, but will gradually soften over time and kind of allows us to adjust to new circumstances. With complicated grief, there's this sensation that pain sort of remains overwhelming. It remains persistent. And complicated grief out of all these, sort of types is a natural response to a profound loss, but really can very much benefit from more additional therapeutic support. And then finally, disenfranchised grief is this grief experiences oftentimes unacknowledged, invalidated, or minimized by others, right? Loss that is not recognized as socially legitimate or kind of worthy of mourning. And then the breast cancer experience, this can feel extraordinarily common. And I'm going to talk about that here on a future slide as well. So I just want to say that, for individuals and families navigating a breast cancer diagnosis, anticipatory grief is really not only just about fearing what's to come, right? That fear of maybe, kind of the inevitable, where will this go? It's really about navigating or grieving the loss of certainty itself, right? So this anticipatory grief can emerge at the time of diagnosis, can really intensify during treatment, and that can oftentimes resurface, with each scan, with each appointment. And so for caregivers and loved ones, this could look like dreading treatment results, worrying about reoccurrence, mourning changes in these roles or relationships as responsibilities grow, kind of carrying that emotional burden of really witnessing somebody going through a painful experience. It can also be tied to these uncertain timelines. What are we dealing with? Disruption of hope and plans for the future. Because a lot of family members and caregivers can keep these fears and losses private, right, in an effort to kind of protect our loved ones, anticipatory grief can oftentimes be experienced in silence, and it can be a really isolating thing. And so I think naming anticipatory grief for what it is just can be really, I think, validating. It can be healing and help us recognize, I'm not crazy. This is a form of grief that I'm kind of holding on a day to day, and finding ways to really express that. Disenfranchised grief is, grief that is, as I said, very real, but is not fully recognized or validated or supported by others. And I think in the breast cancer experience, it can sound like, at least I caught it early. You should be grateful you survived. You look great. You'd never know you were going through what you're going through. And I think while often, well-intentioned, these responses can unintentionally shut down grief that really deserves acknowledgement, that deserves witnessing. And this grief can arise around a whole variety of different experiences. It can also emerge from the experience of kind of like looking fine on the outside, while also, we know feeling profoundly changed and vulnerable on the inside. And so, I think the other point I want to make too, the survivors can oftentimes carry guilt about having survived when others, did not, alongside this pressure to remain grateful and positive rather than being honest about our losses. So I think it's just, also, as I talked about with anticipated grief, really naming this can be a really powerful act of validation, because it helps all of us recognize that these losses are real, that they are worthy of acknowledgement, and kind of helps to kind of shift from this place of silence and misunderstanding to hopefully true expression. Also very important to acknowledge that people with breast cancer frequently experience non-death related grief, and that the losses can be invisible to others, but are really deeply real, right? Changes to the body, to identity, to relationships, to this future that was assumed. And because, cancer is often a prolonged experience with these kind of different shifting chapters, I think grief is rarely defined as a single kind of defined moment. And it tends to be cumulative, kind of this layered, returning, evolving experience kind of across the arc of the cancer experience. So in light of this, just some of the losses around breast cancer are very significant. And oftentimes, we just as a culture don't know how to name this. So I also forgot to mention, as we're going through this, if there's something that comes up for you in your own experience, please feel free to use the chat box. I'm curious for people just to hear, you think about the losses that we don't always name, if there's other things that come up for people in your own experience as someone who has navigated or is navigating the cancer experience, or in the caregiver role, what else kind of emerges for people when you think about this? And we can come back to that at the end. I want to make sure that throughout this, we're kind of integrating people's lived experiences into this presentation. Just want to also name that, caregivers and supporters are often the invisible grievers in the cancer experience. And this cultural narrative, tends to center, rightly so, the person with the diagnosis, but people who love them are grieving too. And sometimes in ways that are not named or witnessed. And so, the grief of watching someone you love kind of suffer or feel in pain, not being able to take away the pain, the grief of the relationship shifting, right? Becoming a caregiver when you were once a partner or a child or a friend, right? There's the grief of your own life really reorganizing around the treatment schedules, the fear of what will come, the uncertainty. And I think that there's also, just to, say clearly, this kind of particular kind of disenfranchised grief that caregivers carry, the sense of, that maybe we're not entitled to our own grief because we're not the one who's sick. And just to name this very clearly, because I think this can also, I know this in my own experiences, can lead to isolation, to kind of suppression, and this reality of, where does grief have this outlet if I don't have somebody to witness this? And I think that, for supporters and caregivers, most of us, what we need most is the same thing that the person that we love, who's living with cancer needs, right? Someone to really witness our grief without trying to fix it. And so just to really say, as we're going through this content, if somebody is in that caregiving role, just that, some of the tools I'm going to talk about here are also for you. So I'm going to transition to some more of kind of the tools or section. And I just want to bring in this quote from Dr. Diane Meyer, who's an internal medicine doctor at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And she says, the only treatment for existential and spiritual pain is relationship, attention, sitting with, not trying to fix. And this willingness to be with and engage the person in giving voice to suffering is such a powerful intervention. It is not about we can fix everything, but we really can but we can enable giving voice to profound suffering. And that makes a huge difference. And I love this quote because it's really, it's about this idea, that presence as intervention is more than sufficient. Oftentimes it's exactly what we need. At the end of the day, that's what we all want, to be met with this empathetic, positive regard, not meant to feel crazy or isolated in whatever we're feeling. So just some of the ways, that in our own work and my own, kind of grief training experience of working with people with all sorts of illnesses, including breast cancer, I think some of the things that oftentimes, kind of when we think about like ways that are not especially helpful when we come alongside of, right? Listening with this intention to respond. And I think we've all had that experience of, you're sharing something and the person you're with is just on the edge of their seat waiting for you to take a mini breath, and they can come in and share all the things that they want you to know about this experience, right? But the opposite of that, feeling like there is all the space in the world for whatever you need to share with me right now. Right, to watch where we deny or invalidate another person's experience, this sort of sense of, well, you shouldn't feel that way. At least, kind of as I have in here, these dismissive platitudes. Well, at least you ... Interrupting, right? For those of us who are kind of in these vulnerable, high need states, like kind of active interruption can oftentimes just really shut everything down. My life story, chapter 43, right? We all want to be of help and to kind of, in my own experience, I have learned this and this and this, but we know, right? When we're in those states of feeling overwhelmed, of kind of having almost too many things, whether it's decision overwhelm, feeling energy, kind of from an energy body, feeling drained, just not having, when somebody comes in and shares, all of the details, it oftentimes actually doesn't apply to what's going on for us, right? So just watching where it's kind of like that oversharing one direction or another, and is this actually what somebody needs? That place of asking unending questions, right? Is this really something that would be helpful for this person to talk about? Or am I asking these questions just out of sheer curiosity? And then again, kind of listening with that intention to fix or solve the problem, versus, am I here to just my presence as being sufficient, and really kind of wanting to hear what's going on for somebody. How we might listen around the grief experience, right? Really listening with the intention to deeply understand. I am here with you because I really do want to understand what it is to be in your body, to experience what you're experiencing. Really bringing compassionate presence to what is. You don't have to be anything other than what you are right now. You don't have to say anything other than what's true for you right now. That's what I want to hear from you. Really doing what we can to convey accurate empathy. I really hear the depth of your experience. I may not understand it, but I hear the depth of what you're going through. And it's big. It's really big where you are right now. being willing to enter into their hell. And I think that's just this kind of thing of like, where do we create a sense of separation of, oh, that you're experiencing this, but I'm over here. And how do we give people the experience of kind of moving towards what they're in, of being with them and what they're in? And then finally, right, kind of this at a loss for words, something as simple as thank you for sharing with me, thank you for trusting me. So I share all of that just to say whether we are navigating, kind of an illness experience ourselves, whether we are supporting somebody in this, kind of reorienting to the basics of, when we are deep within, kind of a grief experience, what is actually useful to us? So I'm just curious, maybe if those who have access to the chat box, I'm going to go into some tools after this, but I'm just curious from your own experiences, what has someone said or done, right, that feels kind of helpful, whether it was, you were in an illness experience or kind of in the depths of a grief experience? What was something that someone said or done that was helpful? And then curious, what was not helpful? And I think oftentimes in these spaces of, kind of co-learning and community, what you all kind of can share with one another is oftentimes a lot more useful and validating than anything that I might kind of share. So just curious, when you hear that question, hopefully some of you do have access to the chat box. What has been helpful as you've listened, and maybe it's something that you yourself did, that you were, kind of in a companion or a caregiver role and found, yeah, I actually, saw that when I was able to show up in this way, it was really helpful to my loved one, to my friend, etc. So I'll just pause here for a moment and see, does anybody have anything you want to share with the community one way or the other? And if not, it's okay. We'll just keep moving forward. But I also always don't like just to be the talking head, kind of talking at you. But I think it's important. We all have a lot of lived experience and wisdom around this to also be able to add to the conversation. Okay. Well, if any of you are typing, great. If not, we can kind of come back to the non-recorded portion. Oh, great. Brandy says, when my caregivers or friends or family admit they don't know what to say or if this is an okay question. So I think, Brandy, I'm reading that is when people are kind of not just going through the motions of making assumptions about your experience, but actually kind of seeking to get a clear sense of like what is actually useful to you. And if I'm understanding that incorrectly, we can kind of come back at the end and revisit that. Yeah, thank you. And if that's what you meant, that's a great kind of cue up to kind of some of the places where I want to go next in terms of some of the tools that I think are really useful to highlight. Okay, you said yes. Great. Thanks, Brandy. So I have found that, oftentimes when it's either me and my own grief experience or me showing up to support somebody else navigating serious illness, and inevitably always grief on one level is going to kind of emerge from that. But oftentimes we don't have kind of the cultural practice or the framework to really kind of refine or hone in and say, yeah, this is helpful to me and this is not helpful to me. And so Megan Devine wrote a book called It's Okay, You're Not Okay. And she's got this online project called Refuge in Grief. And one of the resources, which we will share out, Jenny will share out later with everybody, talks about, do this, not that, how to help a grieving friend. And so, she's kind of got this don't list and this do list. And some of the don't fact check or correct, don't compare griefs, don't be a cheerleader, don't talk about later. Some of the do's that she has on this, do ask questions, do remember the grief is theirs, do mirror their reality. And I think that, for the most part, the don'ts and the do's are generally agreed upon by people. Yeah, it's helpful when you do this and you don't do this. But I have found that a lot of times there's some of these don'ts that people will say to me, actually, that would be really helpful. Like I've had a friend say, I actually do need a cheerleader. I do need somebody to kind of come and meet me and say, and remind me of all the things that really are going well in my life, right? The things that I do love. I do need somebody to talk about later, because when you talk about later, that actually makes me kind of feel like I've got this trajectory that I'm working with that helps me feel hopeful. And so a lot of times, what I will do is sit down with a person or a family with this list and say, let's just start talking about what actually on here feels true for you. To Brandy's point, right? Oftentimes people will admit, I don't know what to say or do. Help me understand what specifically would be helpful, beneficial, supportive to you. And I think starting with something like this list here just allows you to start to refine. Okay, great. Your don't be a cheerleader is actually on a do list for you. That's really helpful for you. And just to start to distill and kind of develop a sensitivity about what you particularly as the person navigating illness, or the person, the kind of the caregiver, if we're in a caregiver role, what is the person, what is actually really beneficial to them. So just one example of kind of initiating some of these conversations. There's another thing. There's an organization here in Oregon called Clear Morning. And the woman who founded it actually went through a really devastating loss. Her 2-year-old daughter was killed in a car accident by a drunk driver. And in her own grief experience, she found those supporting me actually have absolutely no idea what to do for me, right? And in this case, it was an accident, but I think we can apply this to, the experience of navigating cancer. And, so some of the things she has here, so this grief supporters manual emerged from her own grief experience, and then her work as a therapist and working with others in the depths of, kind of illness and grief. So as the grief supporters manual is an example, right? As your supporter, you can trust I will let you be yourself, not hurry you along through your day or your week or your grief. Have an abundance of compassion, be myself and honor my boundaries, etc. And so I have used this as another tool to sit down with people and say, if I'm in the supporter role, say, let's have an exchange here and kind of work to get clarity on what can I offer and what do you need? And the grief supporters manual has kind of been morphed to say, you can trust that every Tuesday I will call you in the afternoon for a check-in, because it really matters to me that there's consistency there. Every weekend I will show up to take your dog out for a walk and to have, a meal on the porch. You can trust that I will clearly articulate, when I'm feeling overwhelmed or actually can't show up for you. And I think it just another example where that helps to create sort of this baseline understanding around what do people need, what are their expectations, and then where can I, as kind of supporter, show up. We have very minimal practice or sort of I think kind of the muscle exercised around getting clear on what our needs look like. And then the other reality is our needs can often shift from experience to experience. And so just to get into the practice of really not being afraid as supporter to get clear on what somebody else needs. And as one navigating the grief or illness experience, getting clear with ourselves about what we really need, and then being able to actually articulate to others and not be apologetic or afraid to really say what that is. I oftentimes also have people do this social ecosystem mapping. I think can be this kind of nebulous understanding of who is actually in my corner. When I'm feeling deep need or grief emerge, or a place of kind of vulnerability or overwhelm, where are the places that I actually turn to for support? And so I think when I've worked with a lot of people, especially as, kind of in the work that we do as an organization, encouraging people to sit down and, the way you can do this is kind of in that yellow, you got to be at the center of things. And then to say, who are those people on that kind of outer concentric circle who I know I can really rely upon, right? Then when I am in the depths of need, when that kind of grief experience is emerging, I, without a question, can call and reach out to these people. And then we start to map, okay, and then outside of that, where are other places or resources that I get support? And I think this is just a really useful exercise in that oftentimes we can have the sensation of, I am not, who am I surrounded by? What are the resources I might turn to when I am feeling, that kind of grief emergence? Who are my people? And so mapping it out and actually seeing this tangibly before us, I think is another really worthwhile exercise to be able to kind of know where we turn for support. And then the grief positionality model, I'm not sure if any of you have seen this before. I think this becomes especially useful when we think of grief as, this community experience rather than simply just an individual one. And it reminds us that our experience of loss is influenced by our relationship to the person who is ill, and then our connection to those affected in our own social roles. So when a diagnosis occurs, there's a lot of people impacted: family members, close friends, neighbors, coworkers, faith community members, right? They all can experience grief, but from very different positions. So rather than assuming everyone is grieving in the same way or has the same needs, this grief positionality really encourages us to recognize, these differences and then to respond accordingly. So one way to think about this is through these kind of concentric circles of impact, and that those closest to the loss often carry the deepest emotional burden and oftentimes have the least capacity to, kind of do anything, offer practical support, or even kind of know what they need, right? And then people further from the center can be less affected by the loss itself, but have a different capacity to really provide assistance, to organize resources and show up, right? So I think the question kind of becomes, well, where am I positioned and what is my role in all of this? And so, at the center, as an example, would be, the aggrieved, or those who really need support, is the person navigating the diagnosis. The person on the kind of concentric circle from them are people who are deeply experienced by whatever's happening, kind of diagnosis or illness wise. And then those outside of them are affected, but in a different way. And ultimately, this helps us to move away from asking, well, how do I help, to thinking, well, what kind of support is appropriate and helpful from where I stand? And then I think the other essential piece to this, right? I know when my son died, people would come in and say, I am so affected by what's happening for you, and just kind of fall apart in my lap, right? That there was this deep emotional experience. It happened a lot for me when I was a child and my mom had breast cancer, and this feeling of, I am so sorry for your family. And I would find myself actually being the one comforting others in their grief. With this comfort in and dump out model, what it helps us to think about is, if I am the person standing on the circle that's right outside of, as we call it, the aggrieved, or the person who's kind of navigating the diagnosis, I am going to work to focus all of my comfort in, and then I turn around and I think about, I am going to dump out or seek support from people who are in those wider concentric circles. And I think what this helps us to do is to really orient and think about, where am I, kind of directing support? Where am I directing care? And then where am I, turning around and getting support elsewhere? And this just helps to ensure that the person who is most impacted by experience is not always the one who is taking care of everybody in those outer circles, right? That there's appropriate directional kind of seeking support away from that person. It doesn't mean that that person doesn't get involved in all the conversations, right? That we're really aware of what their experience is, but that we seek support from a, we go and we seek support in a different place. And then finally, this is just a somatic expressions of grief handout that I think is really helpful to really orient that so much of, kind of the expression of grief happens in a very body-based somatic way. And so I think this just, kind of helps us to really, remember that grief is not just an emotional state. It actually integrates and involves a lot of the kind of somatic self as well, and helps just to remember, right? When I have a headache, when I feel really nauseous, when I'm having all these other kind of body experiences, that oftentimes can very well be, an expression of grief that I'm just not recognizing. So just to kind of close with this idea of self-stewardship, self-stewardship during cancer, I think can feel really complicated in ways that maybe doesn't at other times in life, right? Treatment can be so exhausting. There's this sense of kind of the body changing. There may be days when the idea of caring or being cared for feels really impossible. And so just to reframe self stewardship for this context, that it's not about adding one more thing to your to-do list. It's not about, kind of this idea of, oh, bubble baths or green juice, but it's really about, this honest, ongoing attentiveness to what you need, whether you are in the person, kind of living with cancer, whether you are kind of in that survivorship state, whether you are a caregiver, right? Thinking about what do you actually need and giving yourself permission to have these needs in the first place. And I think for a lot of people navigating cancer, one of the most sort of significant grief experiences is a relationship with your own body. This body that felt familiar and trustworthy can now feel like there's this experience of betrayal. And so I think self-stewardship in this context can look like speaking to your body with the same kindness that you would offer a dear friend who was suffering, right? Today, I recognize I am in the midst of deep grief, and that is what's happening today, right? Kind of noticing what your body needs and really responding to that without judgment, allowing the body to be really a source of information rather than a source of shame, and recognizing that grief itself will, as I said earlier, will oftentimes emerge or express itself somatically. And then, I think also practicing this place of pause, this kind of brief, intentional moment of acknowledgement, whether it's after appointments or treatments or difficult conversations, right? Recognizing I am in the midst of something profound and I really am doing the best that I can. And then finally, getting clear, as I've talked about throughout this whole time, right? Really getting clear on what quality or type of support do you need, and not really being afraid to ask for that. As I have here on the screen, right, that this idea of you cannot pour from an empty vessel, but you also don't have to be full to offer something. You just have to be honest about what you have and what you need. And so hopefully some of these tools I've talked about offer up a different level of kind of willingness or potential to start to think about, what are the true needs, especially around the grief experience, and what do we start to do or think about differently to really seek support. So this slide kind of just includes some of the list of resources that I'll share afterwards. And then there's my contact information. We can also share that out afterwards. If Jenny wants to share, any website or contact info, I'm happy to have that shared out with this group.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn off the recording and then give everyone a chance to answer questions. And if you'd like to turn off this recording. There we go.